but you could also attribute those kinds of things, if you wanted to, and I chose religious myths. And so I didn't pursue any of that. And apparently, not only have you pursued it, but you've pried the lid off of sort of a Pandora's box, if I'm not mistaken.
As I said, I just thought that this little bit of research that I was going to do was just going to take a few weeks, and it really, when I began to find out the vast quantities of evidence that had been suppressed, it just was one thing was just leading to another, and it was just taking 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and I wasn't getting to the bottom of it, 5 years, 6 years. It took me 8 years until I figured out, well, basically I had pretty much found most of the major skeletons that were in the closet there. Now, I think there's a lot more, and as time goes on, I find that people are writing to me, they're cluing me into other discoveries, but I thought I had the basic lay of the land after about 8 years. But I tell you, it really did make me, I have to confess, it made me a little bit angry as I started to find out more and more about this. I just could not believe the audacity of the mainstream scientific community, that they could be sitting on so much information that contradicted what they had been telling the public. It really made me a little bit angry, I have to confess.
Well, it makes me angry too, and extremely curious. What was the first major discovery that you made when you began to dig into this that you can honestly say actually contradicts and almost could be said to destroy the modern anthropological teachings that, well, if I were to go to college today, which I'm not about to at my age, but if I were to go to college and study anthropology, I would get a completely different story from what the evidence that you've turned up is telling us. What is the first major discovery that you made that would cause any reasonable person to say, wow, we've really been scammed here?
Well, the one case that I found really fascinating right in the beginning of my research, and which still fascinates me today, is the California gold mine discoveries. In the last century, there was a gold rush in California. Gold was discovered in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and people from all over the United States went to California to get the gold. And when they first went there, they were panning for gold in the streams. But later on, they began to dig tunnels into the sides of mountains through solid rock to get out the gold. And sometimes inside these tunnels, hundreds, perhaps even 1,000 or more feet inside these tunnels, in the solid rock, the miners were finding human skeletons, just like ours, not ape men, but skeletons of anatomically modern humans like ourselves.
Now, when you say solid rock, what are you talking about?
Well, they were digging these tunnels into the sides of mountains, which were composed of, at first, heavy layers of volcanic rock called basalt.
Mm-hmm.
And then after digging through those, then you get into this very compact, the gold-bearing deposits, which are old river deposits dating back 50 million years, where you had a mixture of sand and stone and flakes and nuggets of gold that had solidified into a very hard conglomerate rock. So that's the material that they were digging into, and these materials, as I said, they were covered over by hundreds of feet of solid basalt and volcanic rock. The discoveries were made in tunnels that were dug through this rock. In other words, it was an area where there were no fissures through which little objects could come down. Obviously, these weren't skeletons that were buried by Indians because, as I said, to get to these things, the miners had to dig through solid rock to get to the point where they found these objects
mm-hmm.
and skeletons embedded in this rock. And according to the modern geological reports, the rock in which these skeletons and objects are found is about 50 million years old. Now that's really quite extraordinary because according to your orthodox scientific ideas, human beings like those skeletons there, human beings like ourselves didn't come into existence until about 100,000 years ago, and then only in Africa, according to the modern ideas.
Leaky,
so
yeah.
to have evidence for anatomically modern humans existing in California 50 million years ago, it is quite shocking from the standpoint of modern science. Now, from the standpoint of some of these ancient traditions and writings, it wouldn't be surprising at all, because they'd expect to find evidence for human presence going back even further than that. But in terms of modern science, it's completely, totally out of the question. They would say that at that time, 50 million years ago, you wouldn't have had even your most primitive apes and monkeys existing at that time. So to have human beings existing at that time, that was really quite extraordinary. Now all of this evidence, it was collected by a Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the state geologist of California at the time. Now, he was a professional scientist, a geologist. He wrote a massive book about these discoveries, which was published by Harvard University in 1883. But the question was, well, why don't we hear about these discoveries today? You won't find them mentioned in the textbooks. You won't find the objects on display in the museums. You don't hear it talked about, by the scientists who appear on these television specials that you see on PBS and the History Channel and the Learning Channel. You don't hear about it. And why is that? It's because of what I call this process of knowledge filtration. And the person who did the suppressing of this particular evidence was a scientist, a very influential scientist named Dr. William B. Holmes. He was working at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and he said about this Dr. Whitney out in California, he said, well, if this Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, then he wouldn't have announced his discoveries despite the imposing array of facts with which he was confronted. In other words, if the facts, even a great number of well-attested facts, goes against the particular theory of human origins that is held by the orthodox scientific community, then those facts have to be put aside, and the person that reports them has to be discredited. And that's exactly what happened. Those discoveries were suppressed. They were filtered out. And, I had my own little personal experience with the knowledge filtration process connected with those California gold mine discoveries. Because I think two things are important here. The very facts themselves and what they say is important, and the whole process by which they are suppressed and continue to be suppressed is also very interesting. That has to be documented. So I've always tried to document both things. The factual evidence itself and its extraordinary significance for our whole concept of human origins and antiquity, and also, and perhaps even more important, I find it more interesting, more fascinating and intriguing, is the process by which this evidence is filtered out, the process by which it's suppressed. And I had a very interesting experience with that myself. You mentioned earlier that my book, Forbidden Archaeology, had been featured in an NBC television special which aired in February 1996 called The Mysterious Origins of Man, hosted by Charlton Heston. I also appeared in that show. But when they were filming it, I told the producers they should go to the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Natural History at the University of California at Berkeley, because that is where these objects from the California gold mines are being kept. Now, when they got in touch with the museum officials, they were told, well, you're working on a television program. You probably have a very tight deadline. We just wouldn't have the time to go and search for these objects and bring them up for you to film. So then the producers told them, well, no, we have 6 months. We have plenty of time. Let's just see the objects. And then the museum officials came up with another excuse. They said, well, we have a very tight budget. We would have to pay our workers overtime to have them go and bring these artifacts out, and we just can't afford to do it. The producers came back with an offer to pay all the overtime expenses for the workers, pay all the expenses, whatever's required,